On September 7, 1982, the Labor Day weekend was disrupted when one of Professor Howard Appledorf's neighbors spotted the splintered back door to his lakefront condo and called the police. When the Gainesville, Florida police arrived, they found a staged scene. I don't mean staged in the traditional criminal investigative sense. I mean the killers seemed to have taken pleasure in creating a heightened sense of reality. Appledorf was dead on his sofa, bound and asphyxiated. His shirt was off, and a cigarette had been extinguished on his stomach. The word murder, red drum, were written on the living room wall. The murderers had laid out a dining set for their submarine sandwiches. There was a fourth plate with a note that read either, "Howard, too bad you weren't here," or "Howard, I wish you could join us." Reports differ. Investigators believe Appledorf was alive, restrained and slowly suffocating to death as his assailants partied for up to 3 hours. At the time of his murder, Howard Appledorf had come to national attention as the junk food man for his theory that junk food had as much nutritional value as fruits and vegetables. His classes at the University of Florida were one of the most popular classes the university offered. As investigators began to probe into Professor Appledorf's life, they found that he was separated from his wife. They found people who knew Appledorf in and around the campus said either that they didn't think that he was gay or that he sometimes hinted at his sexuality, but he mostly liked to keep his connections and sex out of town, which is where he met 19-year-old Gary Bound, using his escort name Gary McNichol. Appledorf was in San Francisco while attending a conference in June of 1982. He met Bound on Polk Street, a neighborhood that featured escorts who hung out in the bars and on the street. Appledorf took Bound to the Hilton where he was staying, paying him $200, which is more than $700 today, for a 2-day stay. During this time, Appledorf bought Bound clothes, giving Bound another $200 before Appledorf returned to his home in Florida. The two maintained contact, and in August of 1982, Appledorf wired $100 to Bound in New York, wiring him another $25 for gas so he could make it to Appledorf's home. Bound wasn't alone. He brought two of his friends with him, 18-year-old Paul Everson and 15-year-old Shane Kennedy, who police say were known in Manhattan as the Hustling Trio. After an evening of heavy drinking, Appledorf's checkbook was stolen. The three men attempted to steal $900 from Appledorf's account. The plan was thwarted when a bank teller who knew the professor pretended to agree to cash the check and called the police. The trio was arrested. According to a friend, when Appledorf refused to post the bond, Bound threatened to expose Appledorf as a gay man. In custody, that's exactly what Bound did. He told the police the reason that he had the check was that the professor was paying him for sexual services rendered. For good measure, he told the police that Appledorf had molested the 15-year-old Shane Kennedy. Police considered Bound's allegations spiteful, choosing not to investigate them. When these claims made their way back to Appledorf, he asked that the charges be dropped, providing the trio left Gainesville. On Thursday, September 2nd, 1982, slightly relieved but mostly apprehensive, Professor Appledorf changed the locks at his condo and headed to New York, where he had been asked to speak at a conference. At lunch, he told people at his table that a few of his students he'd allowed to stay with him had robbed him, and he was still nervous. Professor Appledorf had every reason to be nervous because Bound, Everson, and Kennedy had no intention of leaving town. When they were released, and as Appledorf made his way to New York, the trio had walked the 6 miles from the police station to Appledorf's condo. Paul Everson broke in through the condo's back door, and once inside, they watched television, ate Appledorf's food, drank his liquor, and trashed the place. On September 3rd, 1982, Bound called the university to find out when Appledorf would be back. He was told he'd be back the following Tuesday. By Tuesday, September 7th, the trio had found 2 gold rings belonging to Appledorf. Bound and Everson pawned the rings and bought 3 Subway sandwiches. Back at Appledorf's, they continued to watch TV until they heard the key turn in the door, signaling that Appledorf was home. When Appledorf walked into his condo, he was confused. He demanded to know what the trio were doing there. They told him that they wanted plane tickets back to New York. Appledorf refused, saying he didn't have the money. According to Gainesville police, Kennedy blocked Appledorf from leaving, with Bound shutting the front door. According to the report, Appledorf struck Kennedy in the face. With this, Everson hit Appledorf in the back of the head with a metal pan. Appledorf sank to the floor, and they tied him up. They tied his ankles together with a belt, and a tie bound his knees. A knotted sheet covered his head. When the emergency medical technicians removed the sheet, they found a canvas bag covering his head, secured around his throat with a necktie. 2 towels were wrapped around his neck. When the technicians removed the bag to uncover Appledorf's face, they found that he had been gagged with one tie and blindfolded with the other. At some stage, Appledorf was put on the sofa. Bound demanded Appledorf's bank information, and Appledorf complied. Everson went off to retrieve $200, but he didn't bother to disguise himself, and the surveillance camera picked up the theft. According to later confessions, Appledorf begged for his life, saying they didn't have to do this, he'd give them whatever they wanted. The Gainesville police report of the crime states that Kennedy got sick before any of this happened at the sight of Appledorf being hit over the head, and he fled the condo, vomiting outside. The report says Kennedy never went back into the condo. I might add, he also didn't flee. With Mr. Appledorf dead, and before leaving, they further staged the scene by covering him in a carpet, which had a metal tag with Appledorf's name on it. One investigator said, "It was as if they were telling us, yes, that's him." Red rum was written on the wall, which many of you know is from The Shining. The child writes it on the door with his mother's lipstick. In addition, the words, "Howard, we love you, sincerely," was also written. Later, Everson would say Sleaze Sisters from the movie Times Square was the inspiration. Sleaze Sisters were also a popular glam rock band at the time. In a final act of staging, someone left a somewhat mocking note on a steno pad near the front door. It read, "I realize murder is a felony crime, but I don't want whoever finds the body to know that I'm criminally insane. I have no control of what I do. I know I won't, something illegible, be caught for the crime because I have something illegible of getting away. But I'm very sorry that this is how Howard Appledorf had to go. I didn't mean it. Help me." Signed, X. What strikes me about the level of staging, from the trashing of Appledorf's condo to the picnic they laid out and enjoyed as Appledorf died, to all of the written messages, is just how utterly juvenile all of it is, how impulsive, brutal, and angry, but utterly lacking in planning, particularly as to what comes after, the aftermath. The trio piled into Appledorf's blue Pontiac Firebird and headed to New York. Bone, Everson, and Kennedy went back to their haunt on East 53rd Street in Manhattan. Much like Polk Street in San Francisco, the neighborhood was known as a hangout for male sex workers and their johns. Because of the attempted check fraud, the police knew about the trio right away. Working with New York police and the gay community and bar patrons, it didn't take long before investigators began to find people who would tell them that the trio discussed the murder widely. On September 8, 1982, police located Appledorf's Firebird and waited for the driver to return. As Bound approached the car, he noticed the police and sprinted. He led police in a high-speed chase, sometimes reaching 100 miles an hour, occasionally going down one-way streets the wrong way, until he was finally stopped by a roadblock. Everson and Kennedy were arrested later that same evening. The three were charged with first-degree murder, and the court decided that Kennedy would be tried as an adult. In custody, Bound told police that he had suggested the ritualistic staging because he wanted to make the crime appear to be quote-unquote crazy. He told police he wrote the note on the empty plate addressed to Appledorf. Appledorf's murder happened in the middle of what came to be known as the culture wars. Conservative politicians condemned music videos for corrupting young people with vulgar anti-authoritarian messages. The 1970s and its plague of cults, with its strains of Charles Manson never too far away, fed into the media's take on how and why Appledorf had been murdered. They went wild with all the usual speculation about cults, devil worship, and of course witchcraft. But none of this was true. What was true was that three young men were drawn to one another to survive having been kicked out of their families, left to make it on their own, each one of them with his own catalog of emotional damage. When joined together, the sparks ignited into a mindless rampage of murderous cruelty. In 1983, before and during the trial, the trio seemed prepared to give the public what it seemed to be clamoring for. Lawyers for Kennedy, now 16, claimed that Appledorf had sexually assaulted him. His lawyer released a statement that went further. It read, "Shane said that the other two, Everson and Bowen, saw him at a bus station and that he was kidnapped by them and prostituted by them in Times Square. There was also a kind of Stockholm syndrome after that, in which he became friends with his captors." In October of 1983, Kennedy was allowed to plead guilty to burglary, robbery, grand theft of a car belonging to the victim, aided in no small part by the fact that his co-defendants agreed that he had never come back into the house after Appledorf had been attacked and went down. In 1983, both Bowen and Everson changed their pleas to guilty. In exchange, the prosecution agreed to take the death penalty off the table. Everson's father told the Boston Globe, "There's no sense in locking him up, not in jail. The kid is sick, he needs help." The two men were sentenced to life in prison with an eligibility for parole in 25 years. Kennedy was sentenced to 4 years in prison, and when he was released, struggling with mental health issues, he launched a stalking campaign against the gay designer Todd Olam. Kennedy, now 28, was committed to Bellevue Hospital for an extended stay. Bowen and Everson are still in prison in Florida. Howard Appledorf was a beloved professor who sparked the imagination of his students, challenging them to think outside of the box. I wonder what he would have made of the fact that his junk food theory has been soundly repudiated. I wonder if he would have moved on to other frontiers, other fields of study. For me, this case is profoundly sad. In some ways, all of the parties in the story are victims of homophobia. The trio, all of them young gay men, all of them forced onto the street, all of them becoming predators. As for Howard Appledorf, I think it is easy to come down hard on him for his use of young escorts. Obviously, if there was sexual abuse involving a minor, Appledorf should have been prosecuted. But I would also offer this. Howard Appledorf was trying to grapple with his sexual identity at a time when being a gay academic would have most likely meant the end of his career. Homophobia and the growing AIDS hysteria might have meant either integrating your whole self into yourself, being willing to pay the price, or doing what many queer folks have done through the centuries, hiding and hoping for momentary glimpses of light and happiness. Appledorf made the second choice and paid a terrible price. Professor Howard Appledorf was a brilliant, quirky man who gave much to his friends. One friend said that he was warm and friendly, but he always kept a little of himself out of sight. While this is another cautionary tale about life lived fretfully in the closet, and while the rate of homelessness among queer youth is still alarmingly high, I look forward to a day when young people and older people, whomever they are, coming out of the closet, feel that it is safe and they are met with a soft landing, either in their families of origin or in a family that they cobble together. To quote Alice Walker, "Each one pull one back into the sun. We who have stood over so many graves know that no matter what they do, all of us must live or none." Thanks for joining me. Please subscribe to the channel.